Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming out today to the East Hampton Library to this author talk given by Jeffrey Sussman, Baer and Barney Ross, Jewish Heroes of Boxing. There hasn't been anything written on these two excellent boxers in many years, and I think you'll find this book to be quite interesting, with a lot of insights on their lives, a lot of insights on what was going on at the time, some film references to motion pictures that they may have been appeared in or referenced in. And it's a wonderful Christmas gift or Hanukkah gift, and we have copies right at the back there that Jeffrey will sign. And let me turn it over to Jeffrey Sussman.
Thank you very much. A number of people have asked me how I came to write this book, why I wrote it. It's not a subject that that other people had thought of. And so I just wanted to tell you how the idea came to me of why I wrote this book. When I was 12 years old, I was one of the shorter, skinnier kids in my class, and my father was concerned that bigger kids would pick on me and beat me up. So my father, who had grown up in a very tough neighborhood and learned to fight and was sort of almost like an amateur boxer in a way, one day he brought home a pair of boxing gloves, a jump rope, and a speed bag, and we set it up in the basement of our home, and my father gave me boxing lessons. And when I learned the elements of boxing, he then took me to a place called Stillman's Gym, which was at the time the most famous boxing gym in the United States, where many of the heavyweight fighters had trained. And he knew Lou Stillman, who owned the gym, and arranged for him to have a middleweight fighter. It was an Italian middleweight. I can't remember his last name. His first name was Nick. And Nick gave me 10 boxing lessons and taught me how to jab, to deliver a right cross, how to feint, how to slip a punch, how to bob and weave, and so forth. In addition, my father had a very good friend growing up named Abe Simon, who became a heavyweight boxer. Abe, when he was by the time he graduated from high school, he was about 6'4" and weighed 240 pounds, and was playing football for his high school football team. He went to a high school called John Adams High School in Queens. And after a football game, there were a number of boxing promoters in the stands, and they went to the locker room after the football game, and they asked Abe if he would like to become a boxer. He came from a poor immigrant family, and it was an opportunity for him to make a lot of money. So he said, sure, he would become a boxer, and he was signed to train with one of the greatest boxing trainers of all time, a man named Freddie Brown. And Abe went on to knock out a heavyweight contender named Jersey Joe Walcott, who later on became a heavyweight champion. And after knocking out Jersey Joe Walcott, Abe became a contender for the heavyweight title and fought Joe Louis twice in 1940 and 1941 and lost both times. But one of the interesting things that my father told me about Abe Simon was that my father and Abe belonged to a Jewish social club. And during the 1920s and 1930s, there was a tremendous rise of anti-Semitism in the United States. And there was a group called the German-American Bund, which was pro-Nazi at the time. And at this social club, there were 4 teenage members of the German-American Bund who were shouting anti-Semitic slurs and epithets outside of this social club. And Abe Simon, who, as I said, was enormous, went out and with a single punch knocked out 2 of them. And then with the third one, he according to my father, he hit him in the chin, hit him in the stomach, hit him in the chin again, and knocked him out. And the fourth one ran off, shouting that there was a Jewish thug on the loose and people should watch out for themselves. that was sort of the background that got me interested in this. And then a number of years ago, I met a fellow out here named Peter Wood, who he is the stepson of a local musician and a former church organist named Jane Wood, and his father Guy Wood was a lyricist during the 1940s and 50s. And I was telling these stories to Peter, and Peter suggested that I start writing about this for a website called boxing.com, which I did. And after writing about 15 articles and short stories for boxing.com, I became well acquainted with the careers and lives of Max, Baer, and Barney Ross. And I started doing a lot of research about it. And I decided that this is something I would like to write about. And in order to make this more than just a book about boxing, to make it put it into a historical context, I also investigated what was going on in terms of the rise of anti-Semitism in the United States and why it was happening to the extent that it was. And there were three major proponents of anti-Semitism in the United States at that time. One was a Catholic priest named Father Charles Coughlin, who had the most successful radio program in the United States, 30 million listeners a week. And he hated Franklin Roosevelt, he hated the communists, and he hated the Jews, in that order pretty much. And he would normally refer to President Roosevelt on his radio show as President Rosenfeld. And the folk singer, Woody Guthrie, composed a lyric about Father Coughlin, and I just have 4 lines from it here. He said, "Here comes Charles Coughlin with his chain, gas on his gut, and Hitler on his brain." And he was very pro-Hitler and pro-Mussolini, and in his weekly radio talks would praise them to the skies. The other one was the great innovative car maker, Henry Ford, who published a newspaper called the Dearborn Independent. And it had to be sold in every Ford dealership around the United States. And the front page article in every issue was called The International Jew. And in that, Henry Ford said that basically that the Jews had to be eliminated from the United States. And he was a favorite of Adolf Hitler. He is the only American who's mentioned and praised in Mein Kampf. And his collected articles of the International Jew were collected in 2 volumes called The International Jew, and it became the second most successful book in Nazi Germany after Mein Kampf. And it was required reading for all high school graduates in Germany during the time of the Third Reich. Eventually, Henry Ford was sued, and he was prevented from writing the International Jew in the Dearborn Independent. The third one was Charles Lindbergh, the great aviator who flew the St. Louis from New York to Paris. He became a champion of the Nazis and delivered speeches in the United States in the 1930s stating that there were only 3 groups that wanted war with Germany: the British, Roosevelt, and the Jews. And he delivered a speech called the Des Moines speech, and it was a virulently anti-Semitic speech. And after it was delivered, Franklin Roosevelt said to his Secretary of the Treasury that this speech sounded as if it had been written by Joseph Goebbels. That's how bad he thought it was. And even Lindbergh's wife thought that that her husband was acting almost like a cartoon version of a typical anti-Semite at the time. So with this background, I decided to find out what role Jewish boxers were playing in this time that was rife with anti-Semitism. And I discovered that from 1940 to 1941, there were 628 Jewish boxers in the United States, and 12 of them approximately 12 of them, were world champions in different weight classes, from featherweight, bantamweight, lightweight, welterweight. There was only one heavyweight boxing champion, and that was Max Baer. So I'll tell you a little bit about Max Baer. He was a fascinating a fellow. He grew up on a ranch in Northern California. By the time he was a senior in high school, he was already 6 feet tall. And his sister was an inch taller than he was. And she was the one who protected him. Max did not like to fight. He was a very pacific fellow. And he worked very hard on this farm. He would get up every morning at 3 o'clock in the morning and go to local restaurants and collect the garbage to feed to the pigs that they raised on the restaurant on the ranch. And for that, his father paid him 35 cents a day. This was in the late 1920s. And one night, Max and some friends of his went to a local dance, and they saw a pickup truck parked outside, and there was a big jug of wine in the back of the pickup truck. This is during Prohibition. And Max and his friends finished off the wine that was in this jug. And the lumberjack who owned the truck saw this and was infuriated and took out after them. When the boys saw this guy chasing them, they all took off. Max was at the back of the line, and the lumberjack grabbed him by his shirt collar, managed to spin him around, and punched him in the face. It didn't have any effect on Max. He just looked at the man, startled. But his natural reaction was to punch back. And he punched the man and knocked him unconscious, and the man lay on the ground for about 5 minutes. There was a man at the dance who was a local boxing promoter, and he said to Max, "Have you ever thought of boxing?" And Max at the time was a big fan of a heavyweight champion named Jack Dempsey, and so was his mother. He said, "Well, I have to talk to my mother about this." And he talked to his mother, and his mother said, "Sure, go ahead and do it. You'll earn more than 35 cents a night." And in fact, he was getting $35 for each amateur fight. Now, his first important fight was against a fighter named Frankie Campbell. That wasn't his real name. His real last name was Camilli, and he was the brother of a famous baseball player named Dolph Camilli. But at the time, and in that area in Northern California, there was a lot of prejudice against Italians. They had been immigrants that were working in the harbor and so forth in San Francisco. And so he took on a name that had no ethnic quality to it. He took the name of Frankie Campbell. And in his fight with Max Baer, he suffered a terrible loss, and Max Baer knocked him unconscious. And the guy didn't wake up. He was taken to a hospital on a stretcher, and the next day he died. Max was very, very upset about this, and he didn't fight for the next 6 months. And then he had 6 fights after that. And the money that he got from each of those 6 fights, he gave to Frankie Campbell's widow. Now, later on, when Max Baer became a very successful man and made millions of dollars, he paid for all of Frankie Campbell's children to go to college. He paid their tuition. He felt he owed them that. Now, after his winning a number of bouts on the West Coast, his Max Baer's manager, a man named Ansel Hoffman, brought him to New York, and Max continued to win fight after fight. However, he hated training. He was a person who liked the nightlife, who liked going out with beautiful women. He dated chorus girls, actresses, waitresses, anyone who was beautiful. And he married a very beautiful socialite at that time named Dorothy Dunbar, who they were married for only 2 years. They divorced, and she had 6 subsequent husbands after Max. But finally, Max was supposed to fight a man named Max Schmeling, who was Hitler's favorite boxer. And he was considered to represent the Aryan race and what they called an Übermensch. This fight was to take place at Yankee Stadium. And it was the first fight that had $1 million gate, and 60,000 fans showed up for this fight. And it was in 1933 at the height of the Depression, and people didn't have money to go to fights, but probably half the people at that arena that night were Jewish, because they wanted to see a Jewish fighter beat up the man who was Hitler's favorite boxer. And my father was one of those people who went there, and he said it was very, very exciting. Max Baer had stitched on his boxing trunks a Star of David, and his manager, Ansel Hoffman, told him what the Nazis wanted to do and what Max Schmeling represented. And this was the first year that Hitler had come to power and was getting tremendous notoriety all over the world. Well, Max was so incensed at what the Nazis intended that he came out of his corner at the beginning of the fight and started pummeling Max Schmeling. Max Schmeling didn't know what was hitting him, basically. And this went on for 10 rounds, and Schmeling was getting so badly beaten that the referee had to stop the fight in the 10th round. So half the fans at that fight, maybe 30,000, were Jews, and they all stood up and cheered. I mean, this was a wonderful accomplishment for them. And because of this, Max Baer became a hero to all the big movie moguls in Hollywood, most of whom were Jewish. And they wrote a film for him to star in called The Prize Fighter and the Lady, which starred Max Baer and Myrna Loy. And it turned out that Max Baer was quite a good actor. He not only acted in this movie, but he also sang and danced. He was very, very popular and very good at this. And in 1935, when the movie came out, it was voted one of the 10 best movies of the year. But Max Baer alienated himself from some of the movie producers because he went on to have affairs with most of the big Hollywood stars at the time and took them away from their roles as movie actresses, including Greta Garbo and Jean Harlow and some others. Then Max fought a man named Primo Carnera, who was probably the biggest prize fighter who ever lived. He was either 6'7" or 6'8", depending on what records you look at. And he had basically been a circus strongman and had been taken over by the mafia and owned by an Irish West Side gangster named Oni Madden, who was a precursor to a gang called the Westies on the Upper West Side. And they fixed every fight that Primo Carnera had. He really wasn't a boxer. He just looked like a boxer, and he was immensely strong and big. And when it came time for him to fight Max Baer, his gangster handlers tried to get Max Baer to throw the fight, as Primo Carnera's other opponents had. And Max Baer told them to take a hike. And for some reason, they never bothered him. And Max Baer beat up Primo Carnera, knocked him down 11 times, and felt so badly that he was knocking him down so often that he said to the referee, "You've got to stop this fight. I mean, this is ridiculous." And Max became, as a result of that, the heavyweight champion of the world. That was in 1935, I think. Now the mafia dropped Primo Carnera after that because he was a loser, and they didn't want a loser. And they also stole all of his money. And after that fight, Primo Carnera wound up in the hospital with a broken rib, a broken jaw, and a fractured bone in his arm. And the mob wouldn't pay for it because he was no longer an asset to them. So Max Baer paid all of his hospital bills. The next fight that Max Baer had was with a down-and-out a dock worker named James J. Braddock, and this was made into a movie called The Cinderella Man, which really was very inaccurate in the way that it portrayed Max Baer. It made him seem boorish and but he flew to Los Angeles the following week. And he arrived late at night, and he had his driver take him to the cemetery where Max was buried. And the gate to the cemetery was closed. And Primo and his driver climbed over the fence of the cemetery. They found Max's grave. Primo Carnera knelt at the grave, crossed himself, and said a prayer, because Max Baer had been the closest friend that he had ever had, and helped to pay for all of his expenses, and also got him a career after his boxing career ended as a professional wrestler. And wrestling was all fixed anyway. It was really kind of a circus performance. But he made sure that Primo Carnera earned a lot of money and was able to get back on his feet. And also helped to make sure that Primo Carnera had enough money for his son and his daughter to go to college. And his son became a very successful physician in Los Angeles. Now, Barney Ross, excuse me, was a different story altogether. His real name was Dov Beryl Rasovsky, and his father had been a poor Talmudic scholar on the Lower East Side of New York and couldn't make a living there, and moved to a neighborhood in Chicago called the Maxwell Street Ghetto, which was a Jewish ghetto in Chicago. And he opened a small grocery store there. And one night, two hold-up men came into the grocery store to hold him up. And he foolishly lunged at one of them, who then shot him, and then shot him twice more. And he